good morning, everyone. Welcome to our community Bible study. And as you see, I'm so used to wearing my mask that I left it on. So remember to wear your mask, watch your distance, and wash your hands. Those are the 3 W's that I'm afraid we're going to have to live with for a while. But if we're careful, it makes a difference. This is the 6th in our series of profiles in faith. And we're going to talk about Joseph. Not Joseph from the Christian scriptures, but Joseph from the Hebrew scriptures. Joseph of the coat of many colors. Joseph who even, the musical, that Joseph in the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat from the 70s, as only you could do in the 60s and 70s. That's the Joseph we're talking about. In the scripture, it's from Genesis chapter 37, chapter 39, and 40. Now, this will be the first of at least 2 studies on Joseph because his story is just so full. So you remember there's Abraham, his 2 sons, Isaac and Ishmael, Isaac's son Jacob and Esau, and then Jacob, who we talked about last week, was renamed Israel. You're familiar with that name. And between his 2 wives and their servants, Jacob had 12 sons, whom later we will know as the 12 tribes of Israel. And by Jacob's wife Rachel, he had 2 sons, Joseph and Benjamin. And because Rachel was his favorite, poor Leah, but Rachel was his favorite, then Joseph and Benjamin were also his favorite sons. So that's the genealogy, the tree of Joseph. And now we're going to begin Genesis 37. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, in the land of Canaan. And this is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, who was a young man of 17, at the beginning of our story here, he was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now, if you have had children and one of them tattled on the others, it may have been useful to you as the parent, but boy, brothers and sisters do not like it when one of them tattles on the other. And that is what Joseph did. He brought a bad report. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age. And he made an ornate robe for him. It evidently stood out. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Can you imagine? These are young men who are tending flocks of sheep and goats, and their clothing is work clothing. And here comes Joseph wearing this suit of many colors, this coat. That's not meant for work clothing. It's meant for showing off at a party or something. And so that just gets to them because it reminds them that they're the workers and he's the freeloader. Or at least I'm sure that's what they thought. Well, Joseph provides some salt into their wounds as well. Verse 5, Joseph had a dream. Instead of keeping it to himself, he told it to his brothers, and they hated him all the more. He said to him, "Listen to this dream I had." Can you picture? He's wearing this fancy coat. "We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field, doing work, when suddenly my sheaf of grain rose and stood upright, while yours gathered around and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you think and intend that you're going to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" They were his older brothers. And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Boy, it was not smart for him to show that attitude to his brothers. Guess what? He does it again.
Yeah.
Verse 9. Then Joseph had another dream and told it to his brothers. Listen, he said, I had another dream. And this time the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. Oh boy, what an ego he has. Verse 10. So when Joseph told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, what is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come down and bow to the ground before you? His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept that matter in his mind. Verse 12. Joseph is going to pay for what his attitude with his brothers. So verse 12, now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, as you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I'm going to send you to them. Why, he didn't go in the first place. Well, he was favored. He got to stay at home a little bit more. Very well, Joseph said. So his father said to him, go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me. So he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. Well, you know, this just shows the conflict among the father and the sons. The father is using his son to spy on the others and creating conflict, and the brother to brother. You know, brothers, even if they're all nice, good to each other, often get into fights and stuff because that's just how things are. Verse 18. But the other brothers saw him in the distance, and their resentment must have been building, because before he even reached to where they were, they plotted to kill him. Here comes that dreamer, they said to each other. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns, these water holes, and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. Woo! Man, all it took was one brother to say, and they all jumped in on this thing. Except when Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue Joseph from their hands. Let's not take his life, he said. Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him. Reuben said this because he intended to come back and rescue him later when they were gone and take him back to his father. Reuben, I think, was also thinking of how much Joseph meant to his father and what this would do to him. Well, when Joseph came back to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, of course, because that was a sign of his authority. The ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him in the cistern. The cistern was empty and there was no water in it, so at least he didn't drown. 25. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. A little bit further east, coming on their travels, their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. So they were close to this trade route. Judah said to his brothers, what will we gain if we kill our brother and then cover up his blood? I have a better idea. Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. And his brothers agreed. So when these Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. When Reuben came back to the cistern because he thought he was going to rescue Joseph and found he wasn't there, he tore his clothes, which was a common thing when you are mourning. Oh my God, this is happening. They ripped their clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, the boy isn't there. Where can I turn now? So together the brothers, they got Joseph's robe, that pretty colorful robe. They slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood of that goat. They took the robe back to their father and said, we found this. They concocted this story. We found this, examine it to see whether it is your son's robe. He recognized it and said, it is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces. Had all that blood on it. Then Jacob tore his clothes in grief and mourning, put on sackcloth, and mourned his son for many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him. He refused to be comforted. No, he said, I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave. So his father wept for him. Boy, what a sad story for a father to have lost his son and believe he was dead, all because of his brothers. Verse 36, meanwhile, the Midianites, those who were on that trade route, sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. I suppose they got a good price. Now we're going to skip over to verse 39 and learn about Joseph in the house of Potiphar. But I think it's interesting to see, our record of his story is hindsight, of looking back, and we're looking at how, in spite of whatever happened, God had plans for Jacob, Israel, and his descendants to continue, those 12 tribes. And he had a plan to use Joseph down the road to help rescue and continue all of that. And so, in spite of whatever happens, and Joseph, let me tell you, Joseph falls into an awful lot of trouble. And those who knew him at the time might say he deserved at least some of what he got, because he was one of those that was annoying and thought he was better than others. And I'm sure his brothers and maybe even others would have said, yeah, somebody needs to bring him back, cut him down to size, bring his ego back down to earth. But God used him in spite of all of those things. So here we come. Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. Here's part of what our understanding of God's involvement. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered in what he did. He lived in the house of his Egyptian master. So he was not just living in whatever the slave quarters would have been. He was living in the house. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, he was successful. God was helping him. And the Lord gave him success in everything he did. Joseph found favor in his master's eyes, and he became his attendant. So Potiphar put him in charge of his whole household, and he entrusted to his care everything that he owned. Joseph must have impressed him well. Verse 5, from the time he put him in charge of his household and all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of Potiphar the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care, with Joseph in charge. He did not have to concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Boy, Potiphar found a good man to just turn things over so Potiphar could enjoy his life. Joseph was blessed no matter what. Now we learn here the other part of verse 6. Joseph, remember, he was 17 when he was sold, so he was a young man. Joseph was well built and handsome. Now this is in the scripture here, folks. I didn't add that. That's not from some soap opera. This is in the scripture. Joseph was well built and handsome. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph. Oh dear. And said, come to bed with me. But Joseph refused. With me in charge, he told her, my master does not have to concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he entrusts to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you're his wife. How then could I betray him? How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? See, we don't know until now that how much that his family, his father, his mother, that they had taught him about the fear and the respect and the way that we live when we follow God. And here it comes up. He was a young man. He could have been tempted and slept with this lady, but he was not willing to do what was wicked, sin against God, or betray his master. Verse 10, and though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. He was trying to avoid it. Day after day. Boy, young man, that was a tough situation. So verse 11, one day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants were inside. Uh-oh, you can see the trouble coming. So the master's wife caught him by his cloak, grabbed it and said, come to bed with me. But he left his cloak in her hand as he ran out of the house. When she saw that he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house, she called the servants. Look, she said to him, this Hebrew who has been brought to us, this Hebrew here, not by name, this Hebrew who has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. And when he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. Boy, what a tall tale. So she kept his cloak beside her until the master came home. Then she told him this story. That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me and made to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. When Potiphar, the master, heard the story his wife told him, he said, this is how your slave treated me, and he burned with anger. He had trusted Joseph, and he believed Joseph betrayed him. It was his wife who betrayed him. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. Wow. Another disaster for Joseph. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden sees that Joseph has got, we might say he's a lucky guy. He's got the golden touch. No matter what he does, turns to gold. The warden saw that Joseph was being blessed by God no matter what. So, guess what? The warden puts Joseph in charge of everybody held in the prison. And he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden had to pay no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in everything he did. So Joseph is stuck in this prison, but he's now entrusted. He's in charge. He is going to be able to still be blessed by God. And now chapter 40 as we wrap up this section. So sometime later, the baker of the king of Egypt the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the Pharaoh. Pharaoh was angry with these two officials, the cupbearer and chief baker, and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, the same prison where Joseph was confined. So the captain of the guard, he didn't want to deal with them. He assigned them to Joseph, and Joseph attended to them. After they had been in custody for some time, each of those two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, they had a dream on the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to oversee them the next morning, he saw they were dejected, so he asked those officials who were in custody in the master's house, "Why do you look sad today?" They said, "We both had dreams, but there's no one to interpret them." They were disturbed by these dreams. Then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." You remember Joseph is known for the bright Technicolor dream coat and for his interpreting dreams. Number 9. So the chief cupbearer, that's the person who brought the cup of wine or whatever Pharaoh was drinking, probably had to test it and make sure it was safe. So that's what a cupbearer did. Told Joseph his dream. And he said to him, "In my dream I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and squeezed them into the cup and put the cup in his hand." Okay. Joseph said, "This is what it means. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position. And you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cup bearer. But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Please mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I've done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon." Joseph was like, "Please have some mercy." Verse 16. Now the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation of the other gentleman's dreams. So he said, "Joseph, I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh. But the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head." "This is what that means," Joseph said. "The 3 baskets are also 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole." Ooh, cut it off, stick him on a pole. "And the birds will eat away your flesh." That's a nightmare. Doesn't say anything about how he reacts to that, but I'm sure he was not happy. I'm sure he wanted to choke Joseph for that dream, but Joseph was in charge. So now, verse 20. The 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all of his officials, and he did lift up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. In other words, he welcomed them back and gave them an honored position. It was his birthday. He was celebrating. He was generous to bring them back. He restored the cupbearer to his position so that he once again put the cup in Pharaoh's hand. Pharaoh trusted him that he would be safe. But he impaled the chief baker. We don't know why. Just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. The cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph, and he forgot all about him. So Joseph was still stuck in the dungeon, even though he had helped interpret the dream of the cupbearer to his benefit. Well, we're going to stop here because this is this is Joseph's downfall. He started as the favored son of a wealthy Hebrew man, Jacob, Israel. His brothers went against him. They were going to kill him. They sold him into slavery. He gets a good position because God's blessing him, and he's accused of attempting rape, which is not true. Then he goes to prison. And then he's in this dungeon, and yeah, God blesses him, and he's doing pretty well, but he's still there, and he wants to get out. And he has a chance because one of Pharaoh's officials gets reinstated. And he says, "Please tell them that I'm innocent. Tell them I've done these good things." Didn't happen. It did not happen. So Joseph is downtrodden, even though God still blesses him. He's stuck in a prison in a foreign country. Not a good place for a young man to be. Well, next week we'll talk about that God has more plans for Joseph than we think. Have a good day. See you next week.